Hi everyone, in this video we'll be learning how to install a virtual machine using a feature in Windows called Hyper-V. So Hyper-V is a hypervisor. A hypervisor is a software which allows you to install operating systems on top of your operating system. So you probably will be using a Windows 10, Windows 11, but you want to learn how to probably practice how to use a Linux distribution or probably a firewall, so or even a server, Windows Server um, operating system. So this feature allows you to install it on top of your operating system. So we have some common types of hypervisors. We have Hyper-V, which is native to Windows. But we also have other types, other open source, including what we call Oracle VM VirtualBox. And we also have VMware Workstation, which has some features being free, whereas you also can buy some premium features as well. But today we'll just look at how to use Hyper-V to install Windows Server 2022. So if you go onto the Windows Learn platform, Microsoft Learn platform, you can learn more about Hyper-V. You can search it on the Microsoft Learn platform. So we just quickly look through reasons for virtualizing. So it allows you to install an older version of Windows or a non-Windows operating system, as we talked about. It makes it easy to create or remove different operating systems. And personally, I think if probably you want to learn how to use an operating system like a Windows server, but you don't want to use it in a production environment where if you make certain settings, you make errors in any kind of configurations, you probably risk causing havoc to a network. You can learn and make all your mistakes using a virtual machine before you decide to translate your configurations or what you have learned into a real life situation. So this is a benefit of using a hypervisor like a Hyper-V. So Hyper-V is native to Windows, as we said, but not all versions of Windows can run Hyper-V. So if we look at the system requirements, it mentions here that Hyper-V is available on 64-bit versions of Windows 10 Pro, Enterprise, and Education. It is not available on the Home Edition. So if you are running the Home Edition of Windows 10, you are unlikely to be able to install Hyper-V. And yes, so most computers run Hyper-V. However, each virtual machine runs a completely separate operating system. So you can generally run more than one operating system, but it's subject to how much hardware you have. So if you have 4 gigs of RAM, most operating system will require at least 2 gig. So it is recommended for me personally, I think you should have a minimum of 8 gigs of RAM because your operating system itself, your computer will use some of that RAM, and the guest operating system that you install will also use that RAM as well. So you should have adequate amount of RAM if you intend to install more than one operating system on Hyper-V. So from here, we want to look at, let's go down and see the kind of the supported Windows guest operating system. So the types of operating systems you can install. I've mentioned Linux. You can install Linux, but there are more. So yes, so these are the versions of Windows 10 you can install on Hyper-V. So Windows 10, Windows 8, you can install Windows 7, Service Pack 1, Windows 7, Windows Vista, Windows Server 2019, 2016, 2012, and so forth. So you can check on the Microsoft Learn platform to see all the types that you can install. I believe you can also install Server 2022, which we are going to learn about very soon. So we want to quickly dive into how to install Hyper-V. And in fact, it's already a feature, as we said, on Windows, provided you are not using the Home Edition. So let's go to the control panel. You can search control panel on your desktop, start menu. You can go to control panel, you go to the programs, and then you look out for 10 Windows features on or off, and it should open a window for you, and you should see Hyper-V. So normally it's not a feature everyone uses, so it's not always turned on. So you should check if it is turned on your machine. So you can tick it if it's not, and then click on OK. So if you click on OK, if this is the first time you're doing this, it probably will ask you to restart your machine. So if it does, you can restart your machine and join this video. So from here, it should load some files and then apply the changes. And then probably should ask you to restart your machine. Okay, so once you restart your machine, it's time to launch Hyper-V. So you go into your start menu and then you search for Hyper-V. You would find a Hyper-V manager, which is a newly installed feature once you enable it. So you click on it and it should open up. It should open up a window like this for you. So in this window, you have the Hyper-V manager, and then just beneath it, it has the name of your machine. So this is your host operating system, which will house or hold or host guest machines. So in here, we are going to install Windows Server 2022. So let's go back and download the software. So in Google, you can just search for, Windows evaluation. Windows evaluation. So it should give you the official Microsoft sites and then evaluation center. So in the evaluation center, what the evaluation center does is it gives you certain types of Windows operating systems to test for 180 days. You can always uninstall after 180 days and reinstall. So we want to install Windows Server 2022. So we click on that. And then it tells you that you can get it for free. And so you can download either a virtual machine in Azure. But in this case, we want to run it on Hyper-V, so we can download the ISO. So let's download the ISO. So if you click that tab, it should lead you to another tab. And before you can install, you have to fill certain information like your name. You should fill your last name, your email, your company name, your region, company size, your phone number, and questions before you can download it. So I must say, for a field like company name, if you don't have a company, you probably can type freelance. If you're a student, you can type student. These things are not really strict. Company size, you can type 1. Job role, you can type student. Your country code, you select your country code and your number. And questions are not mandatory. There are no asterisks, so you can decide to leave that. And then you can move on to the download now button. So in the download page, you choose the ISO downloads, and then it will start downloading the file. Okay, so once you download the ISO file, you are now ready to install Windows Server 2022. So if you haven't already closed the Hyper-V manager, you can just open it from the taskbar. If you've already closed it, you can just search for Hyper-V in your start menu, and then you click on Hyper-V manager. Okay, so once you launch your Hyper-V manager, you'd see just below Hyper-V manager that the name of your computer that you're using is just below it. So that's your host machine. This is what is going to be hosting guest operating systems like the Windows Server 2022 that we are just about to install. So to install a new virtual machine, you go to new on your right side of the screen, and then you can do a quick create, or you can click on new and then choose virtual machine. So once you choose virtual machine, it should give you a virtual wizard, and it says that the virtual wizard helps you to create a virtual machine. So you have to go through this, and it says you can just click on finish and create a default type with default values. But if you actually want to go through the process, you click on next. So let's click on next. You give the virtual machine a name. So let's say Homelab, and then let's see Windows Server 2022, and then you can choose a location. If you are okay with the default location, you leave it. But if you have a different part on your hard disk, you want to save it, you check the store in different location, and then you browse to exactly where you want it saved. So for me, I'll just leave it in the default location and click on next. So it says that choose a virtual generation, the generation of this virtual machine. Generation 1 supports 32 bits, 64 bits, and provides virtual hardware which has been available in all previous versions of Hyper-V. We can just go with the first one, and then click on next. And in here, you specify the amount of memory to allocate to this virtual machine. So as we said earlier, depending on the amount of RAM you have on your host machine, you allocate wisely. Otherwise, you may have problems in terms of slow performance or even crashing of your system. So if you have 8 gig, I suppose you probably should um, allocates probably 2 to 4 gigabytes of RAM, not all 8 gig. So I have 20 gigs of RAM, so I can choose to allocate about 4 gigs. So let's do 4096 megabytes. That's for 4 gig of RAM. And you can check use dynamic memory. So if you check use dynamic memory, even though if I allocated a size, that's the maximum amount of RAM it can use, but it changes from time to time. So it can use just 1 gig or even less than 1 gig, depending on how much RAM is needed. So you click on next, and in here, configure your networking. So it's asking you, you can configure the network adapter to use a virtual switch, or it can remain disconnected. So depending on what you want to use it for, if you're testing a software and you don't want it mingling with your host machine, you don't set it to something that connects to your host machine. You can leave it as a default switch, or you can disconnect it totally from all other virtual machines and your host machine. But let's leave it as a default switch, and let's click on next. And in here is asking to create a virtual hard disk. So we created a virtual memory. Now it's asking for a virtual hard disk. So depending on how much disk you have on your system, you should allocate some to the virtual machine. I believe a Windows server should be able to use at least a 20 to 40 gigs of RAM. So let's specify 40 gigs of RAM if you have that amount, but I think 20 should be minimum to use. And so we click on next. I think it should have asked us if we wanted to allocate a dynamic disk. I know for other types of hypervisors it does ask that. I don't see that here. So we click on next. Okay, I think there is. Okay, there isn't. So we click on next, and then you can install the operating system now if you have access to the setup media, or you can install it later. So if you have a media disk, you can do that, but we have the ISO file. So you can just go to the ISO file, browse to where exactly you have the ISO file, and then install. So we have Windows Server 2022 here. You navigate to where it is, and then you click on next. So here gives you a summary of the information. So that will be the name of your server, so generation 1, 4 gigs of memory, default type of switch, hard disk, and then the operating system location. So you click on finish and it should create the new virtual machine for you. So once it's created, you will find the virtual machine you created on top of the window where we have virtual machines, and it's currently turned off. And so when you come to the down on the right hand side, there is a pane on your right, and it gives you the option to connect to this virtual machine. So you double click on connect, and it's telling you that the virtual machine is off. So for Hyper-V, unlike other types of hypervisors, you first have to start the virtual machine and then you connect to it. So in here we have start, or you can just choose start here. So once you click on start, it should launch the virtual machine for you. So you have the Windows Server operating system set up just like you would have for any installation of any operating system. So you click on next, you click on install now, and it should start the setup. Okay, so it should load a window like this for you. So it will give you the types of options you have in installing this Windows Server 2022. So you have the standard edition, which is a recommended. It omits most of the Windows graphical environment. So this allows you to manage it using a command prompt or PowerShell, which is what is normally done by administrators. But we want to have the full desktop experience so that we can learn more about it, because we are not experts. We are still trying to learn. So we can choose either the desktop experience, Windows Standard Evaluation Desktop Experience, or we can choose the Windows Data Center Evaluation Desktop Experience. So it says that this is a full option, consumes more extra space. It can be useful if you want to use a desktop or have an app that requires it. And it's similar with the standard evaluation. So let's just choose a data center evaluation desktop experience and click on next. So once you click on next, it should ask you to read through the license agreement and accept. So if you should read through it, but you can't proceed without accepting. So you can just accept and continue. And so here it will ask you to install either a custom or an upgrade. We are installing a new one, so we click on custom. And then in here, you remember we allocated 40 gigs of RAM, so you have that unallocated space here. So you create a new partition and you click, we are using all 40 gigs, so you click on apply. It says that to ensure that all Windows features work correctly, Windows might create additional partitions for systems files. So you click on OK. So once you click on OK, you should have system reserved and the rest of the partition. So you click on next and it starts installing. It should take a while, so you can just be patient whilst Windows Server 2022 installs. Okay, so once it's done installing, it might restart, so you may have to reconnect to your virtual machine. Yes, so once you reconnect, it will ask you to customize settings. So by default, the username is administrator. And so you have to configure a password. So you choose a password. And then you click on finish. And it should finalize your settings. So once your settings loads, you can use the password that you set to log in as administrator. So once you click on login, it will load your user profiles and launch the desktop. Okay, so once it loads the settings, you should have a desktop like this. So by default, Windows Server 2022 will load a server manager, and that is where you do most of your work from. So let's see down here saying you want to allow your PC to be discoverable. You may choose this if you want it discoverable. That's if you're on an internal network. So you can choose yes or no, dependent. So this is how your Windows Server Manager should look like. So you can add many roles and features. You can use various tools. You can add servers on this Windows server. You can manage servers. You can promote a server to a domain controller where you can add client machines onto this server. There are so many things you can do on Windows Server 2022. And in subsequent videos, we will do a walkthrough on some of the basic features you should use as a Windows administrator. So the final thing we'll do is to shut down this virtual machine. So you go to the start menu in your virtual machine, just like you do if you were using the actual physical machine. So you click on shut down, and there are options, but you can just choose on planned. So the reason for shutting down this server. So you click continue, and then the server should shut down all services and successfully switch off. So once you shut down the server, you can exit and you can turn off the server on the right pane at the down. So you click turn off and it should successfully turn off your virtual machine. So we have come to the end of this tutorial on how to install Windows Server 2022. In subsequent videos, we'll learn how to use various features on Windows Server 2022.